Hi, I'm Josh Mcdowell, and I'm sure glad you were all able to come out tonight. And what I want to do is just share briefly on one aspect of truth that I sure tried to refute. Kind of the background for what I share here was when I was a student in university, I ran into some professors and students whose lives were really different. And I remember one day I was sitting in the dormitory with them, and I asked them the question. I said, what makes your life so differently? And this one young lady looked at me and just said, Jesus Christ. And I just laughed. I thought that was a joke. And I said, don't give me that garbage. I'm fed up with religion, the church, the Bible, everything. And then I couldn't forget that these professors and students right there challenged me as a pre-law student, now get this, to intellectually, to use my mind to examine the claims of Christ as the Son of God, and the Bible is the Word of God. Well, I thought that was a joke, because I really thought that most Christians had two brains. One was lost, and the other was out looking for it. I really believed that. But they kept kind of irritating me with it all the time. And I remember I was at a water fountain. One of the professors said to me, what's the matter, young man? Aren't you willing to be intellectually honest? That was it. I said, okay, I'll accept your challenge. But I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it to refute them. And the whole background of my first book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, was to write a book against Christianity. I figured any fool could do that, and I'd qualify. And I left the university and traveled throughout the United States, England, the Middle East, gathering the evidence to write the book, and I had a problem. When I returned to the university, intellectually, I became convinced that the Bible was true and that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. I'd come to the exact opposite conclusion of what I set out to prove. And one of the areas that I really knew that if I could refute it, I had my case won. And I could look those Christian professors and students right in the eyes and put them down with a clear conscience. And that's when it came to the Bible. I really thought this was a book written years after the time of Christ, way into the 2nd century, and what people didn't like, they took out. What they did like, they added to it, and it looked like a mess put together by a committee. And I figured an intelligent, rational approach to it would totally satisfy my mind and refute it. Was I ever surprised? And what I'd like to do is, in our time together, is just share with you some of the things that I found as an individual as I set out to write my book against the Scriptures, and I ended up not only acknowledging the Scriptures as what I believe now is God's Word, but I also ended up becoming a Christian against everything that I believed.
I believe that most of it goes back to thousands of years, but on a whole, as each generation passed, there are different theories, and they do change the Bible every time they print it.
Yeah.
What do you base that on? Why?
Interpretation. I believe that everybody has to have put some of their opinion in it when it was interpreted.
I don't believe so because there's a lot of different versions that are written, so it's hard to say probably which one is the true first version. Because every religion itself is written in a different version.
I think that the language that was written has been changed, altered, edited over the years, so there would be differences.
I just think over the time, over the years, it'd be changed just like anything else would be changed, kind of like playing telephone. It's all interpreted. And being that it wasn't written in English, I'm sure, I would only think that it would be translated basically to suit how people want it to be.
I think it could be different because there's many changes that will be made that people cannot understand, and different changes that it will go through over time, that when things change, when the word passes, they pass differently from time to time.
Well, if I tell you a story today and you tell that story to someone else, and then that person tells it to someone else, and it goes and transcends hundreds and thousands of years, the story isn't the same at the end as doesn't equal the same story that was originated, does it now?
Really, I'm not sure because, I wasn't like born back then, so unless it's like some kind of evidence or, then probably is, it probably isn't, it could be changed around all the time. I think some of it's the same, but then again, I think some of it's changed by man over time.
I want to start by contexting the whole set of arguments. If you're talking to a young person today, say in a high school or a university, and you make a statement that Jesus Christ is the truth, or the Bible's the truth, or Christianity is the truth, here's a phrase you'll hear. Well, truth changes all the time. Oh, I hear that constantly. Truth changes all the time. And so I'll respond and say, really? Give me an example. The number one example I hear, straight across, whether high school or university, is, people used to believe that the earth was flat, now they believe it's round. I said, that's an example that truth changes? Well, yes. I said, let me ask you two questions. When everybody thought the earth was flat, was it really round? And I've not had one person this day not say, yes, it was. Second question. When everybody came to believe the earth was round, had it always been round? Well, yes. But then wait a minute. Truth didn't change. Your perspective of truth changed. The truth remained the same. The earth was round. Our perspective changed. And then I'll throw this out. What caused people to change their perspective from the earth being flat to the earth being round? And it's interesting, in almost every single focus group with university or high school students, they'll say something like this. Well, the evidence or testimony, experience. I say, that's right. Testimony, experience. Is when people would leave on the ships, the mothers, the wives, the children, the brothers, sisters, the family would go down to say goodbye to them. Why? They truly believed that they would fall off the end of the earth and they would never see their husband or their father or their kids again. They kept going further and further, and they kept thinking, they're going to fall off the edge of the earth. But they kept going further and further, and they kept coming back. And they said, wait a minute. The earth must not be flat. There's no end to the earth. First was personal testimony, and then second, most young people say, well, the evidence or the facts. And I'll say, that's right. They started to examine the evidence. They started to calculate with the stars and everything. They said, wait a minute. The earth isn't flat. There's a curvature to it. And then they would sail, and they'd come all the way back around and say, the earth is not flat. It is round. It was testimony and the evidence, the facts. And then I correlate it this way. I used to believe that the Bible was flat. Now I believe it's round. And what changed my opinion? Two things. Personal testimony, experience. Second, I examined the evidence. And what I want to do, because we have a brief period of time, is just examine some of the evidence. And it will be a very brief presentation to it. But in the book that just came out, I spent the last 4.5 years totally rewriting, updating with the evidence and everything, the old 2 volumes of Evidence and Demands a Verdict into the new Evidence and Demands a Verdict. And everything that I share is completely documented there. Now, in the evidence, whenever you examine any book of history, it doesn't matter if it's the Bible, whatever, any book of antiquity, to determine if it's historically accurate, authentic, if it has integrity to it, if it's accurate, you apply an historiography. And a part of any good historiography, the principles in interpreting history, of studying history, in any good historiography is what's called the bibliographical test. And I remember one student spoke up and said, oh, I knew you'd bring the Bible in. I said, I didn't say Bible. Bibliographical test. Now, a bibliographical test will ask 2 questions of the manuscripts of any work. Now, what is a manuscript? A manuscript, by definition, is a handwritten copy over against a printed copy. A handwritten copy over against a printed copy. And the first question they ask of a manuscript. Now, why do they ask these questions of a manuscript? Because here is 2 issues that I struggled with. Why I needed a historiography, why I needed to study the historical background of the Scriptures. Because there were 2 questions that haunted me. And I think they haunt a lot of people. The first question was this: is what we have today, called the Bible, and I'll look at only the New Testament today, is what we have in the New Testament what was written down 2,000 years ago? I think that's an honest question. Or has it been changed? Like a lot of people say, and usually without documented, oh, it's been changed, what people didn't like, they took out, what they did like, they put in, and it just changed down through the years. So the first question I had to struggle with, is what we have today what was written down? Second question, though, is one even haunted me more. Was what was written down true? Was what was written down true? Because if what was written down wasn't true, I could care less that what we have today is what was written down. And so there were two questions that haunted me before I ever became a Christian.
Truth is really based on facts. The facts that you can accept to be positive or negative. It's hard to put a good definition to that. But I always say truth would have to have a lot of positives to it. Like evidence or living it. You make your own truth in that respect.
I think truth is within the person. And it just naturally evolves.
I think a person finds their own truth. If they feel something is right and they feel that they need to find something out, they will find it. If they don't really care, then they won't find it out.
It could be discovered and created, but created, it's a frame of mind that could be passed on or discovered that someone actually looks for the truth.
I think it's all subjective. I mean, the truth is what it is to you, not to what everybody tells you it's supposed to be. So I think it has to be discovered because the truth for you is going to be different from what it is for other people.
I think in many ways truth is felt inside. It's neither discovered nor created. But it's a sense of knowing that what you comprehend is correct.
So that would make truth relative?
Absolutely.
No, I think you have to create truth. By proving with facts that something does exist. And those facts have to be solid. Take theorems in geometry. They're proven with facts. And to that extent, I think the truth has to have the same kind of basis.
And so this is why I had to examine the manuscripts and the background of the New Testament. And so the first question is, what is the timeline between the original, the autographa, the autographa, and the closest copy? You see, the rule of thumb is this: the closer the copy to the original, usually the greater the accuracy. That's the rule of thumb. Now, it's not always true, but the overwhelming majority of the time, it is true. But see, that question has a problem behind it. And the problem was this: literature of antiquity was written on material that would perish. Much of the New Testament manuscript, like a lot of other literature of antiquity, was written on, it's similar to this here. It's called papyrus. And this is made up of the papyrus reed, which is grown in the very shallow waters of the Nile. And they take these reeds, they would slice them, and then they would place them crisscross, as if you look carefully here, you could see that. And then they'd put a glue on it, and then they'd press it together. And it's amazing. It really came out to be a very strong paper. Now, here was a problem. No matter what they did back then, the material would not last. It was not durable. It would start to rot away. And to show you how sensitive papyrus is, there was an archaeologist that found a portion of the Gospels in a cave. And it was on papyrus. And it had been there for hundreds of years. But the mistake he made, when he took it out of the caves that had been sealed, and certain moisture had been sealed and everything, he took it out into the desert, and he held it up to the light to look like this. and it disintegrated. That's why even like the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept behind tinted glass with a certain temperature and everything, or they disintegrate. And the reason you don't have originals is all the material would rot away. And so that's why you have the bibliographical test. Here you have, say, this is the original and this is a copy. How far is the copy removed from the original? There's many ways to determine the very age of a manuscript. One, probably the best way, is the type of material that it's written on and its age. For example, if it's written on parchment or pottery or the skin of animals or from papyrus, which I already described, in studying that material, you can pretty well determine within a few years of when that manuscript was done, or that portion of a manuscript. Another way is by the division of the text. See, a lot of people don't realize that originally the text was not divided the way that we have it in the Bible today. Over the years, they would divide the text or even begin or end the verse at a different place. And so by studying the division of the text, you can narrow it down to a few years when a manuscript was done. And then if you ever picked up an old book and you're looking at the beginning, and maybe the first letter is kind of ornate or artistic, or there'll be a picture there, a drawing, a graphic. And by studying those in the manuscripts, they did the same thing. And by studying those, you can pretty well determine in a close proximity the years in which a manuscript was done. This morning in my home, I had a friend over, and I said, look what I found. It was a book handwritten back 1,500, almost 500 years ago. And as I opened up, he says, oh, look at the drawing. And see, it's that drawing that often you can determine the age. Those are just a few ways to determine how old a manuscript is. Now, one thing that I've learned over the years, the more I compare the scriptures with other literature of antiquity, the greater appreciation I have of the scriptures in comparison. For example, with Pliny the Younger, known as Plinius Secundus, from the time he wrote to the closest manuscript, everything else rotted away and lost, 750 years. With Caesar, wrote his Gallic Wars in the 1st century. From the time Caesar wrote to the closest manuscript, 1,000 years from the time he wrote. With Plato, from the time he wrote the closest manuscript, 1,200 years. Aristotle wrote his Poetics around 343 BC. The closest manuscript is 1100 AD, 1,400 years later. Everything in between has been lost. Sophocles, 1,400 years. Euripides, 1,500 years. But when it comes to the New Testament, just the New Testament, we now go back within about 50 to 70 to 75 years. And now with some of the new discoveries, they're saying even taking it all the way back to the 50s and the early 60s, which would be within 20 to 30, 35 years. You have the John Ryland papyri, a small portion found in a cave in Egypt that was preserved over all the years, about 125 AD, within 80 years. Then you have the Papyri Bodmer. Now, why is it called papyrus? It's written on papyrus. The Papyri Bodmer II, right around 155 AD. And then you have the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus. So they sound like diseases. Well, these are titles given to some complete copies of the New Testament. Just time-wise, there is more evidence in the manuscripts, time-wise, for the New Testament than any 10 pieces of classical literature combined. And then, with the second question, the first is the timeline. The second question is very critical. And that's this one. How many manuscripts do you have? Say, what do you mean? Well, the greater numbers, say this is the original and here's the copies. The greater number of the copies that you have, the easier it is to reconstruct the original, the autographa, and check out any errors or discrepancies. One of the complaints is, well, you don't have the originals. Well, of course you don't have the originals. Jesus walked and lived on the face of the earth 2,000 years ago. And back then they didn't have the papers I've already described that they have today. But it's not whether do you have the originals or not, but do you have the copies where you can recreate the originals? And this is what I was talking about, that we do have the copies, we do have the material. To me, it totally satisfies my mind that we are able to recreate the original. In fact, you take the Nestle's New Testament Greek, it's probably about half the size of my Bible here, and thicker. And any question in doubt that what we have today was not the original, now think of this, in the Greek, Nestle's New Testament is less than 1/2 of one page. Now when that comes to literature of antiquity, that's miraculous, that's phenomenal. And so the issue is not whether do you have the originals. I mean, at that time, nobody has the originals. The question is there sufficient manuscripts to recreate the autographa, the original? And with the New Testament, I say yes, we do. Now, in comparing with secular literature, for example, Caesar and the Gallic Wars, 10 manuscripts. But nobody in university questions that Caesar fought the Gallic Wars, and for a long time he was the only one that ever survived that wrote about it. 1,000 years, the closest manuscript after he died, and there's only 10 manuscripts. Of Plato, 7 manuscripts. Of Tacitus, the Roman historian. Right now there's less than 20 manuscripts that have ever survived. And then Thucydides, many people consider Thucydides one of the most accurate historians of antiquity. And yet there's only 7 manuscripts. And those are 1,300 years after Thucydides died. Herodotus is 8 manuscripts in about 1,400 years. With Pliny the Younger, there's about 7 manuscripts. With Sophocles, 193, which is one of the most. Euripides, 9. The men and women, Aristotle, there were 13. Now it's up to 49 they've discovered. Well, with the New Testament, just the New Testament, in the new evidence that demands a verdict, I have now been able to document 24,633 manuscripts of just the New Testament. I never even knew they existed until I set out to make a joke of it. And later, I found out the joke was on me. I had not done my homework. Now, let me show you how unique that 24,633 is. Is there any of you here that know the number 2 book in manuscript authority in all of history? The New Testament's number 1. Any of you know the number 2 book in all history in manuscript authority? The Iliad by Homer. 643 manuscripts. That's number 2 in all history. And yet it's interesting, to this day, I've yet to find a teacher or a professor that knew that. I didn't even know it until I set out to make a joke of it. Just number-wise, there is more evidence to examine than any 10 pieces of classical and literature of antiquity put together. But now, you can do this. Take every Bible and destroy it. Take every manuscript and burn it. Destroy every manuscript. Destroy every Bible. And within 150 to 250, 300 years of Christ, closer than any other literature of antiquity, I can reconstruct all but 11 verses of the entire New Testament. You say, no, wait a minute. Without any manuscripts? Without anybody? Yeah. Throw them all away and burn them. And I can go back within 150 to 300 years and reconstruct. So how do you do that? I discovered that the early church fathers, when they would write letters to the churches, or they would give sermons, they would write out and copy quotes out of the scriptures. Well, just like I do. I will copy sometimes a half chapter out through my notes. And they have sometimes, they would copy 3, 4, 5 chapters of the scriptures in corresponding with the churches. And I've now been able to document 86,429 quotations from just the early church fathers. And taking these 86,400 some quotations, You can, without any Bible's manuscript or anything, you can reconstruct all but 11 verses. But I never knew that until I set out to make a joke of it. And I found out later, boy, the joke was on me. That even to recreate much of the original, you don't even have to have a Bible or a transcript. And that is mind-blowing to me. And so, time-wise and number-wise, the Bible stands alone. Now, it doesn't mean it's true, but I think it does mean this, that what we have today is what was written down. Whether what was written down was true or not, but it is what was written down. Now the second question. Was what was written down true? Did Jesus do that? Did he say this? Is this a true rendering of what Christ said and what he did?
I would say parts of it. I don't think it's, again, I think it's all based on things that, based on what has happened, but I don't know if it's actually word for word is exactly what went on. I think it's just somebody's telling a story.
It could be changed at any time, from history to even fiction, like make-believe, and it could be any one of those that they choose.
I don't know. It's a good question. How does one define or ascertain whether something written over the course of centuries is in fact what was intended to be written from the onset?
I mean, I know for me, if I read the Bible, I follow it how I interpret it. So if I think something about it isn't right, then I'm not going to follow that part of it.
There's several lines of argument that I want to share along that. The first is the